If you were to explain for somebody that's never ever tried your wines about your style, what would you say?
I would really describe it as the benchmark for classic Cabernet. The Heitz family did an incredible job of kind of being steadfast in how they produce wine for decades. So you have to think post-Prohibition styles of wine were slightly lower in alcohol, they were aged for much longer, and the way in which we trained and trellis the vines is different than how most of Napa does that today. Now that's a generalization, but Joe was very committed and had incredible resolve in terms of how he thought wine should be made, and that was aging them for a long time in cask, a long time in bottle before release, and really working with the highest pedigree of vineyards that he could access. 60 years kind of into the Heitz legacy, the winemaking has remained incredibly consistent at a time when I think the style of Napa Valley overall has changed quite a bit. And it's something that I'm most honored for, honestly, is that preservation of the classic style.
So please tell me the story and the background of Heitz Cellar.
It's a pretty fascinating story. So it really began in the early 1900s. So Joe Heitz was born in this tiny little town about an hour and a half west of Chicago in 1919. World War II breaks out, kind of throws a wrench into his plans, and he gets stationed in the military down in Fresno. He learns winemaking at this place called the Italian Swiss Colony Plant in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Really falls in love with winemaking and decides to enroll at UC Davis, which is the preeminent viticulture and enology kind of program here in the United States. Graduates with a degree in 1948. And he's looking for jobs, and he moves up to the Napa Valley in the early 1950s, and he works for this really formative person in Napa Valley's history, this gentleman named Andrei Chelychev, who was a Russian viticulturalist who really kind of pushed Napa Valley out of the post-Prohibition era and kind of up until the Judgment of Paris, and he did a lot of key things to shape the future of the valley. So Joe Heitz works for him for about a decade in the 50s, from 51 to 58. So he leaves Napa Valley, he goes back down to Fresno, and then he moves up to Napa Valley in 1961. He purchases 8 acres of this obscure Italian grape called Grignolino, about a mile and a half south of downtown St. Helena, and he founds Heitz Cellar in 1961. And he makes all these really formative decisions to help shape the future of what will become America's most notable wine region. So we make the first ever single vineyard wine in 1966 with Martha's Vineyard. And he really focuses on mono varietal wines, so pure Cabernet Sauvignon coming from single vineyard parcels throughout Napa. And the idea was that the best way to express the sense of place and kind of showcase the terroir of the land was through the lens of a single grape variety. And then the winery sold to another family in 2018. It was important for them that they sold to another family and kept that kind of family legacy going. So they sold to Galen and Lisa Lawrence, who have a history in agriculture in this country. And yeah, I mean, 64 years later, we're basically making the same style of wine we did, 6 decades ago.
Please tell me about the vineyards here and the winery that you have here, and
Sure.
Why are you at this spot?
So Napa Valley overall is one of the most unique wine regions in the world. We're bracketed by 2 mountain ranges. We have the Vaca Mountains to the east that protect us from the inland heat of more desert climate. We have the Mayacamas Mountains to the west that shelter us from the cooling influences of the Pacific. And we have half of the world's major soil types represented in the region overall. Most of the Heitz legacy has been rooted in valley floor vineyards, so vineyards that are really less than 250 feet above sea level. And that tends to have a little bit softer, more generous kind of approach for Cabernet Sauvignon. We do have some parcels high up in the mountains above 1,400 and 1,500 feet elevation. But the majority of soils that we see are things like clay close to the riverbeds. We also have really beautiful gravelly soils along the western benchlands of Oakville and Rutherford. And then high up into the mountains, you get more into volcanic material because both of those mountain ranges are volcanic in nature. But with a region that's a lot smaller than people think, being only 29 miles long and 5 miles wide at its widest point, we have this incredible diversity of microclimates, aspect, and soils to really focus on the grapes that Napa Valley is known for. And those are Bordeaux grape varietals. We really focus on Cabernet Sauvignon purely, but we also have some Chardonnay, a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc, and we've started to play around with some other fun grapes like Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Syrah.
Please tell me of the range that we have here on the table now.
Of course. So we start with 2023 Quartz Creek Vineyard Chardonnay. It's an incredible vineyard that we purchased in 2014. We converted it to organic farming. We got it certified biodynamic from Demeter in 2022. For us, we age this wine in large neutral casks for about 14 months. We do batonnage anywhere from 10 to 14 days, trying to give the wine a little bit more texture and breadth. It doesn't undergo any malolactic fermentation, and we do a small amount of new French oak, about 12%. So really meant to be bright and elegant and crisp, but a very classic style of Chardonnay from the Valley. Then we have the wine that we're most known for, which is our Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. We've been making this wine since 1961. It's always 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's always farmed from organic grapes as well too. It comes from vineyards that are farmed organically. So we source fruit from Rutherford, from Oakville, from Howell Mountain, from St. Helena, from Oak Knoll, from Calistoga. So it really paints that picture. Lot C91 is another 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, and the first vintage was actually 1969. And then we didn't make the wine for 46 years. Played around with the greatest vineyards he was working with at the time, and he declassified a little bit of the fruit. He didn't age it for quite as long as his single vineyard parcels, and so for us it's kind of a step up in terms of pedigree from the Napa Valley Cabernet. And it has a really high percentage of fruit from Martha's Vineyard, which is really our prize parcel in Western Oakville. Then we get into the wines that we're really most known for, which are single vineyard expressions from some of the greatest vineyards and appellations in Napa Valley. So Trailside is my personal favorite. It comes from northeastern Rutherford. We've been farming it since 1984, but the first vintage was 1989, so we're actually going to taste the 30th vintage today. But to me, it's a very classic representation of Rutherford, which is softer, more red-fruited, especially along the eastern side of the valley. We get abundant sun. So it's always the first vineyard we bring in for harvest each year, and it has a really generous kind of approachability when the wines are young. Then we get into Linda Falls Vineyard, which is the smallest production wine that we make. It's a tiny parcel from high up in the mountains of Howell Mountain. So the vineyard sits at about 1,500 feet elevation. We actually purchased the land in the early 2000s, 2001, and we donated 28 acres back to the Land Trust of Napa Valley. So it's a little over 7 acres, it's east facing, so it gets a lot more of the cool morning sun. And for us, we took a very patient approach in terms of making wines from the mountains, because so much of our history has been rooted in the valley floor. But I always get these really high mountain herbs from this wine, so things like juniper and sage, and it tends to have a much more kind of concentrated color and tannin structure than some of the other wines that we make. And then Martha's Vineyard is certainly one of the most well-known wines in American history. It sits along the southwestern portion of Oakville, just downslope from the Harlan family of properties. And what separates Martha's Vineyard from Tokelon, one of the famous vineyards of Oakville, is a north by northwest row of eucalyptus trees. We first made this wine in 1965, and we were so blown away by the quality of fruit that Joe Heitz decided to do something that nobody had ever done in Napa Valley's history.
Then if you look into the crystal ball, into the future, what do you see?
I think very little will change from a winemaking standpoint, honestly. For us, preservation of legacy and post-prohibition styles of winemaking is very important. We're lucky. This style of wine we've been making for the last 60 years is coming back into vogue a little more. I think the big advancements we'll see for us are going to be continuing to refine farming from an organic and biodynamic standpoint.
If you were to give an advice to a young person that wants to start to work in the wine industry or at a winery, what advice would you give?
So you can study the agricultural side of it, you can study the history and the legacy of it. It encompasses climate and conquest and geography and language and geology. And there are so many different paths to go down. To me, more than anything, enjoying the pursuit of it and being kind of flexible and open-minded to see where your career takes you.